200 hardened criminals held their breath. Champagne flutes froze halfway to lips, the crystal catching the dim cathedral light. The sharp, violent crack of a palm against a cheek echoed through the vaulted ceiling like a gunshot. Netta's hand stung, trembling violently as it dropped to her side. Before her stood Aidan Sullivan, the most feared man in Chicago, bearing a spreading red mark on his sharp jaw. Dozens of bodyguards instinctively reached for their holsters. Death was an absolute certainty. But Aidan didn't reach for his gun. He smiled. Welcome to the wedding of the decade. White silk felt remarkably like a shroud when tailored to perfection. Netta stood perfectly still in the center of the basilica's cavernous dressing room. The seamstresses had long since departed, leaving her alone with a dress that cost more than most family homes. It was a masterpiece of Venetian lace and suffocating expectations. She stared at her reflection in the towering antique mirror, searching for something recognizable in the woman staring back. Her dark hair was pinned into a rigid, flawless structure. Her collarbones, stark against the sweetheart neckline, looked fragile enough to snap under the weight of a heavy stare. She did not look like a bride. She looked like a surrender treaty waiting to be signed. The door handle clicked, a sharp metallic sound that sliced through the heavy silence of the room. Her father, Richard Campbell, stepped inside. He looked older than his 58 years, his shoulders bowed beneath the immaculate tailoring of his tuxedo. He smelled of top-shelf bourbon and lingering panic. "It's time, Netta," he said. His voice lacked the booming authority it once carried across boardrooms and backroom poker tables. He was a defeated man. Netta didn't turn around. She kept her eyes fixed on the mirror, watching his reflection hover near the door like a trespassing ghost. "Did you get the confirmation?" she asked, her voice entirely devoid of inflection. Richard swallowed hard. The sound was audible across the room. "Yes, the transfer went through. The Sullivan family has officially absorbed the South Side shipping routes. In exchange, the debts are wiped clean. The boys—" He paused, rubbing a trembling hand over his jaw. "The boys are safe. Declan is on a plane to London. He'll be untouchable there." Declan, her older brother. The impulsive, reckless fool who had tried to skim off Aidan Sullivan's supply lines to pay off a string of disastrous gambling debts. In the old days, a bullet to the back of the head in a muddy trench would have settled the score. But Aidan Sullivan was not a man of the old days. He was a ruthless pragmatist with a law degree and a mind like a steel trap. He didn't just kill his enemies, he acquired them. He stripped them of their assets, their pride, and their autonomy. When Aidan looked at the Campbell family's crumbling empire, he hadn't seen a threat. He had seen an acquisition, and Netta was the ink on the contract. "Untouchable," Netta repeated, the word tasting like ash. "No one is untouchable when it comes to him, Dad. We just bought Declan a stay of execution, and the price was my life." "Netta, please." Richard finally closed the distance between them, his hands hovering awkwardly behind her shoulders, terrified to touch the pristine silk. "Aidan he's a businessman. He understands the value of stability. This marriage guarantees peace. You'll be provided for. You'll be the wife of the most powerful man in this city." Netta finally turned, her eyes, a sharp, piercing hazel, locked onto her father's watery gaze. "I will be a hostage with a ring on her finger. Don't dress it up, Dad. You gambled, Declan lost, and I'm paying the marker." Richard flinched. The blunt force of the truth left him with nothing to say. He offered his arm. Netta looked at the crook of his elbow for a long, agonizing moment. She felt the bile rising in her throat, a sickening cocktail of fear and profound, cynical grief. She had spent her entire life trying to stay out of the family business, choosing art galleries and quiet coffee shops over smoky clubs and hushed conversations about offshore accounts. It didn't matter. The blood in her veins was a currency she couldn't outrun. She took his arm. The walk down the cathedral corridors was a blur of Gothic stonework and the suffocating scent of thousands of white lilies. The flowers had been flown in from Holland. Everything had been flown in. Everything was a display of wealth, power, and absolute dominance. They reached the massive double doors of the sanctuary. 2 men stood on either side. They wore tailored suits, but the bulges under their left arms were unmistakable. They didn't look at Netta. Their eyes scanned the perimeter with the cold, dead detachment of apex predators. Organ music swelled, heavy and oppressive, vibrating through the stone floor and into the soles of her shoes. "Smile, sweetheart," Richard whispered, his voice trembling. "For God's sake, just smile." The heavy oak door swung open. A sea of 200 faces turned toward her. This wasn't a gathering of family and friends celebrating love. It was a summit of the underworld. Politicians who had sold their souls years ago sat shoulder to shoulder with mob capos, corrupt judges, and union bosses. The air in the cathedral was thick, practically humming with dangerous electricity. Every person in the pews knew exactly what this wedding meant. They were here to witness the final subjugation of the Campbell family. Netta kept her chin high. She refused to let them see her shake. She fixed her eyes on the end of the aisle. There he stood. Aidan Sullivan did not look like a brute. He was infuriatingly elegant. Tall, with dark hair swept neatly back, and a profile carved from cold, unforgiving marble. He wore a midnight blue tuxedo that fit him with predatory perfection. His hands were clasped loosely in front of him. But it was his eyes that stopped the breath in Netta's lungs. They were a pale, icy blue, entirely devoid of warmth. As she walked toward him, those eyes locked onto hers. He didn't smile. He didn't look at her with the awe of a groom seeing his bride. He looked at her the way a chess grandmaster looks at the board right before calling checkmate. He owned her, and he wanted her to know it. Every step toward the altar felt like walking through deep water. The sheer gravity of the room pressed against Netta's chest. The silence beneath the swelling organ music was absolute. These men did not whisper. They calculated. When she finally reached the steps of the altar, Richard Campbell hesitated. He was supposed to place Netta's hand into Aidan's. It was a centuries-old tradition of transferring care, but today it was a literal transfer of ownership. Richard's hand shook violently. Aidan stepped forward. He didn't wait for the father of the bride to offer his daughter. He reached out and took Netta's hand himself. His grip was firm, his skin cool. The physical contact sent a jolt of raw adrenaline straight to Netta's heart. She instinctively tried to pull back, just a fraction of an inch, but his fingers tightened instantly. A silent, immediate correction. "Do not pull away." Richard retreated to the front pew, effectively evaporating from the narrative. Netta was alone now. The priest, an older man who had likely turned a blind eye to decades of Sullivan family sins in exchange for generous cathedral donations, began to speak. His Latin was smooth, practiced, and entirely hollow. Netta stared at the intricate embroidery on the priest's vestments, desperately trying to detach her mind from her body. Just get through the vows, say the words, go to the reception, survive. It was a simple, cynical mantra. But Aidan wasn't looking at the priest. He was looking at her. She could feel the weight of his stare, dragging her attention upward. Against her better judgment, she met his eyes. Up close, the icy blue of his irises was layered with a terrifying, quiet intelligence. He wasn't just going through the motions, he was studying her, dissecting her. "You're trembling," he murmured. His voice was a low, resonant baritone, pitched perfectly so that only she could hear it beneath the drone of the priest. "I'm cold." Netta lied, her jaw tight. Aiden's mouth twitched. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "No, you aren't. You're terrified. You look like a doe bleeding out in the snow." Anger, hot and sudden, flared in Netta's chest. It cut through the paralyzing fear. "I am marrying a monster to save my family," she whispered back, keeping her face perfectly serene for the benefit of the audience behind them. "Forgive me if I don't have a bridal glow." "A monster," Aiden repeated softly, testing the word on his tongue as if he found it amusing. "Your brother stole $3 million from my ports, Netta. In any other generation, he would have been dismantled piece by piece and mailed back to your father. I let him live. I absorbed your father's failing empire. I saved your family from ruin. Monster is a very lazy word for a savior. You didn't save us. You bought us. Semantics." The priest paused. It was time for the vows. A young boy, looking utterly terrified, hurried forward with a velvet pillow holding the rings. Aiden picked up the smaller ring. It was a massive, flawless diamond set in cold platinum. The heavy metal felt like a shackle as he slid it onto Netta's finger. "Repeat after me," the priest instructed Aiden. Aiden didn't look at the priest. He kept his eyes locked on Netta. "I, Aiden Sullivan, take you, Netta Campbell, to be my wife, to have and to hold, for richer, for poorer." He spoke the words slowly, deliberately, stripping them of their holy context and turning them into a binding legal contract. "Until death do us part." Netta stared at the ring on her finger. The diamond caught the light, sparkling with a mocking brilliance. "Your turn, my child," the priest prompted gently. Netta opened her mouth, but the words wouldn't come. Her throat seized. She looked past Aiden, catching a glimpse of her father in the front pew. He was staring at the floor, refusing to look at her. He had sold her. Declan had abandoned her. She was entirely, utterly alone. Aiden leaned in slightly. The distance between them vanished. He smelled of bergamot, rain, and something inherently dangerous. "Say the words, Netta," he whispered, but it wasn't a request. It was an order. "I can't," she breathed, panic finally breaking through her meticulously crafted composure. Aiden's expression darkened just a fraction. A micro-expression of pure, unadulterated control. "You can, and you will. You are mine now. Your father's debts are mine. Your brother's life belongs to me. If you embarrass me in front of these people, I will make a phone call before we even reach the reception, and Declan's plane will not land in London." The air left Netta's lungs. A ringing sound started in her ears. He was holding her brother's life over her head right here, at the altar. It wasn't enough that she was sacrificing her future. He demanded she do it with a smile. He wanted her broken. He wanted absolute, unquestioning submission. Something deep inside Netta, something she didn't know existed, snapped. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a violent, involuntary reflex of a trapped animal. The sheer indignity of it all boiled over in a split second. Her right hand pulled free from his grip. She didn't think about the 200 killers sitting behind her. She didn't think about the bodyguards. She didn't think about the consequences. She swung. The slap was spectacular. Her palm connected with Aiden's jaw with a crack that sounded like a dry branch snapping in a silent forest. The force of it whipped his head sharply to the side. The organ music had stopped moments before, leaving the cathedral in absolute, dead silence. The sound of the slap didn't just echo, it reverberated. It bounced off the stained glass windows and rolled down the center aisle. For one agonizing, suspended second, the world simply stopped spinning. Netta stood frozen, her hand stinging with a fiery heat, her chest heaving. The reality of what she had just done crashed down on her with the weight of a falling building. She had just assaulted the head of the Sullivan Syndicate in front of his entire empire. Behind her, the cathedral erupted into chaotic, terrifying movement. It sounded like a mechanical symphony. Clack, clack, clack. The distinct metallic sound of safety catches disengaging rippled through the front rows. Chairs scraped violently against the stone floor. Netta didn't have to turn around to know that at least 30 guns were suddenly leveled at her back. To her right, Aiden's head of security, a massive, scarred man named Tommy, was already over the altar rail. He moved with terrifying speed for a man his size, his hand drawing a heavy black pistol from inside his jacket. His eyes were wide with a mixture of shock and lethal intent. He aimed directly at Netta's chest. "Stand down!" The voice cracked like a whip. It wasn't loud, but it possessed a quiet, absolute authority that froze every man in the room instantly. Aiden hadn't raised his hands. He hadn't shouted. He simply spoke 2 words. He slowly turned his head back to face Netta. A bright, angry red handprint was already blooming across his pale cheek. The contrast was stark, violently colorful against his usual immaculate composure. Netta stood paralyzed, her breath catching in her throat, waiting for the blow that would undoubtedly end her life. She braced herself for the rage. She braced herself for the violence. It didn't come. Aiden stared at her. The icy blue of his eyes had shifted, darkened into something stormy and unreadable. He slowly reached up, his long fingers lightly tracing the red mark on his jaw. Then, the unthinkable happened. Aiden Sullivan let out a low, breathy sound. A chuckle. It was dark, rich, and genuinely amused. The sound was more terrifying than if he had drawn a gun. It sent a collective shiver down the spines of the men in the pews. Aiden Sullivan did not laugh. He certainly didn't laugh when he was disrespected. "Tommy," Aiden said, without taking his eyes off Netta, "put the gun away. You're ruining the aesthetic of my wedding." "Boss." Tommy hesitated, the barrel of his gun dropping only an inch. "I said put it away," Aiden repeated, his tone dropping an octave, slipping into the cold, dead register that preceded extreme violence. Tommy instantly holstered the weapon and stepped back, blending into the shadows of the altar like a chastised hound. The metallic clicks of safeties engaging echoed quietly through the room as the rest of the men followed suit. Netta stood trembling, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stared at Aiden, completely unmoored. Why wasn't she dead? Aiden took a half-step closer to her. The amusement faded from his face, replaced by a strange, intense fascination. He looked at her not as a pawn, not as a ledger entry, but as a living, breathing creature that had just bitten his hand. "Well," Aiden murmured, his voice so quiet the priest couldn't even hear it. "I stand corrected. You aren't a doe in the snow at all, are you, Netta?" Netta swallowed, her throat dry as dust. She couldn't speak. She refused to apologize, but she also knew she was entirely at his mercy. Aiden reached out. Netta flinched, shutting her eyes tightly, expecting him to strike her back. Instead, she felt the warm, calloused pad of his thumb gently brush against her cheekbone, pushing a stray lock of dark hair behind her ear. The touch was agonizingly tender, a jarring contrast to the violent tension suffocating the room. "Open your eyes," he commanded softly. She opened them. He was leaning in close, the scent of bergamot wrapping around her. "I expected a ghost," Aiden whispered, his eyes scanning her flushed face, mapping the defiance still burning beneath her terror. "I expected a hollow shell crying over her father's failures. I didn't expect a fighter." He smiled, a slow, dangerous curving of his lips that made Netta's stomach plummet. I think I am going to enjoy this marriage immensely. He didn't demand an apology. He didn't punish her. He validated the strike. In a twisted, cynical way, she had just passed a test she didn't know she was taking. She had proven she wasn't a victim. She was an adversary. And Aidan Sullivan, a man bored by sycophants and easy victories, was suddenly deeply invested in the game. Aidan turned his head slightly toward the trembling priest, who looked as though he might faint at any moment. "Father," Aidan said, his voice returning to its normal, smooth cadence. I believe she was about to say, "I do." The priest jumped, frantically finding his place in his prayer book. Yes, the bride's vows. Aidan looked back at Netta. The challenge in his eyes was unmistakable. "I didn't break you. Now show them you won't break." Netta looked out at the crowd. 200 men who had expected to see a lamb led to the slaughter were staring at her with a new, cautious respect. She had slapped the devil, and the devil had smiled. She turned back to Aidan. The fear was still there, cold and heavy in her gut, but the panic was gone. He had given her a weapon, his intrigue. If he wanted a fight, if he wanted an adversary in his bed and at his table, she would give him one. She would survive this, not by hiding, but by meeting his darkness with her own. Netta lifted her chin, locking her hazel eyes onto his bruised face. "I, Netta Campbell," she said, her voice ringing out clear and steady, devoid of any tremor. "Take you, Aidan Sullivan, to be my husband." She didn't break eye contact as she recited the rest of the traditional vows. She spoke them like a declaration of war. When she finished, the priest hastily pronounced them husband and wife, rushing through the final blessing, as if hoping to escape the altar before any more violence erupted. "You may kiss the bride," the priest squeaked. Aidan didn't hesitate. He closed the distance between them, wrapping one strong arm around her waist and pulling her flush against his chest. His other hand slid to the nape of her neck, his fingers twisting into her elaborate updo. He leaned down, his mouth hovering just a fraction of an inch above hers. "Let the games begin, Mrs. Sullivan." He breathed against her lips. He kissed her. It wasn't a polite, performative kiss. It was possessive, bruising, and fiercely demanding. It was a kiss that claimed territory. Netta gasped against his mouth, her hands instinctively coming up to push against his chest, but the silk of his tuxedo lapels felt like iron beneath her fingers. She didn't yield, but she didn't pull away. She stood her ground, matching his intensity until he finally, slowly pulled back. Aidan turned to face the crowd, keeping her tucked firmly against his side. His hand rested heavy and warm on her hip. The silence in the cathedral broke. It started with a slow, rhythmic clapping from the front pew, Aidan's underboss. Within seconds, the entire sanctuary erupted into thunderous applause. It was a disturbing, cynical roar of approval from men who understood only power and survival. They walked back down the aisle together. The lilies still smelled like a funeral, but the dynamic had shifted. Netta wasn't walking to her execution anymore. She was walking onto a battlefield. Aidan's thumb stroked the silk of her dress at her waist. "Don't think for a second that slap comes without a price," he murmured softly over the roar of the applause, staring straight ahead at the open cathedral doors. Netta stared straight ahead as well, her heart pounding a steady, defiant rhythm. "I didn't expect it to," she replied coldly. "Bill me." Aidan's chest shook with another silent laugh. The afternoon sun spilled through the open doors, casting long, sharp shadows across the cathedral floor. The wedding of the decade was over. The war for Netta's soul had just begun. Crystal clinked against crystal in a relentless, jarring rhythm. The reception was held at the sprawling Sullivan estate on the shores of Lake Michigan, a fortress disguised as a Gilded Age mansion. Inside the grand ballroom, jazz spilled from a 12-piece band, smooth and distracting, while waiters in crisp white jackets circulated with silver trays of Dom Perignon. It was a flawless facsimile of high society. But underneath the expensive perfume and the velvet drapes, the room smelled of gunpowder and calculated greed. Netta stood near a towering ice sculpture, a glass of champagne gripped so tightly in her hand she was surprised the stem hadn't shattered. Aidan never left her side. His hand rested permanently on the small of her back. It was a light touch, entirely devoid of physical pressure, yet it carried the immense, crushing weight of a branding iron. He was introducing her to the architects of Chicago's underworld. Men with tailored suits and dead eyes stepped forward to offer their congratulations. They kissed her cheek, they shook her hand, and every single one of them let their gaze flicker to the left side of Aidan's face. The red handprint had settled into a dull, bruised purple along his jawline. It was a glaring, impossible anomaly on the face of a man who routinely destroyed people for insubordination. Yet Aidan wore the bruise like a new, bespoke accessory. He didn't turn his head to hide it. He didn't offer a single word of explanation to the capos and lieutenants who stared at it in thinly veiled shock. He simply smiled, his icy blue eyes daring anyone to ask. Nobody did. "You're gripping that glass like it's a weapon," Aidan murmured, leaning down so his mouth brushed the edge of her ear. "Relax, Netta. They're starting to think you don't like them." "I despise them," she replied, her voice a flat, quiet murmur hidden beneath the swell of the jazz band. "And they know it. Why pretend?" "Because civilization is built on pretending," he said, his thumb idly stroking the silk covering her spine. "Look at your father." Netta followed his gaze across the room. Richard Campbell stood near the bar, nursing a heavy glass of scotch. He looked shrunken, entirely stripped of the arrogant bluster that had defined him for decades. Men he used to command now walked past him without a glance. He was a ghost at his own daughter's funeral party. A sharp ache bloomed in Netta's chest, a mixture of profound pity and bitter resentment. "He looks like a broken man," Netta said coldly. "He is a broken man," Aidan corrected effortlessly. "He broke himself when he decided he was smart enough to gamble with my money. I merely swept up the pieces." Before Netta could form a response, a mountain of a man separated from the crowd and stepped into their orbit. It was Tommy, the head of security who had drawn his weapon on her in the cathedral. Up close, the scars crisscrossing his thick neck looked even more jagged. "Boss?" Tommy grunted, offering a brief, stiff nod. Then slowly he turned his heavy gaze to Netta. "Mrs. Sullivan." The title tasted foreign, acidic in the air between them. Netta held Tommy's stare. She remembered the black barrel of his gun leveled at her chest. She remembered the absolute certainty in his eyes that she was a dead woman. "Tommy," Netta said, her voice perfectly level. She didn't flinch. She didn't look away. A heavy, suffocating silence stretched between the three of them. Tommy looked at Aidan, seeking permission, seeking context for this bizarre new dynamic. Aidan simply took a sip of his bourbon, watching his new wife and his chief enforcer size each other up with open, academic interest. "You've got a hell of a swing, Ma'am," Tommy finally said. It wasn't a compliment. It was a factual observation, laced with a very subtle, dangerous warning. "I hope I won't have to use it again," Netta replied smoothly. "I understand dry cleaning a tuxedo is a terrible inconvenience." Tommy's jaw twitched. A rough, grating sound rumbled in his chest, a laugh dragged over gravel. He looked back at Aidan, dipping his head in a gesture of reluctant, genuine respect. The perimeter is secure. The alderman is asking for 5 minutes in the study before he leaves. Give him 3, Aiden instructed, and tell him if he mentions the zoning permits tonight, I'll have his car driven into the lake. Tommy nodded and melted back into the crowd. Aiden turned fully to Netta, handing his half-empty glass to a passing waiter without looking. You handle yourself remarkably well in a room full of wolves, Netta. Most women would be hiding in the bridal suite by now. I'm a Campbell, she said softly, staring out at the sea of criminals. I was raised in the same woods you were, Aiden. I just refused to grow fangs. A fatal mistake, Aiden said. He stepped closer, crowding her space until all she could smell was his bergamot cologne and the sharp scent of his bourbon. In this world, you either bite or you bleed. I think you finally learned that at the altar today. He held out his hand. Dance with me. It wasn't a request. Netta placed her hand in his. He led her to the center of the polished marble floor. The crowd instantly parted, giving them a wide, respectful berth. As the band shifted into a slow, melancholic ballad, Aiden pulled her flush against his chest. There was no awkward space between them, no polite distance. He held her with absolute authority. Netta rested her hand on his shoulder, her muscles coiled tight. She could feel the hard lines of his chest, the slow, steady rhythm of a heart that didn't beat with the frantic anxiety plaguing her own. Everyone is watching, she whispered, keeping her eyes fixed on the knot of his black bow tie. Let them watch. Aiden murmured, resting his cheek briefly against her dark hair. Let them see exactly who you are. They expected a bargaining chip. I'm showing them a queen. They will treat you with the exact level of fear they reserve for me, or I will bury them. Netta finally looked up at him. The bruise on his jaw was inches away. Why? She asked, the genuine confusion bleeding through her armor for the first time all day. You have what you wanted. You have the ports. You have my father's empire. Why go to this extreme to elevate me? I slapped you in front of your entire syndicate. Aiden's eyes darkened, dropping to her lips before meeting her gaze again. Because, Netta, loyalty born of fear is fragile. It shatters the second the fear is gone. But respect forged in fire, that lasts. His hand slid up her spine, his fingers grazing the bare skin at the nape of her neck. You proved today that you aren't afraid to burn. That makes you very, very dangerous. He spun her gently, the heavy silk of her dress flaring around her ankles. And I collect dangerous things. He finished quietly. Midnight brought a suffocating silence to the penthouse suite of the Sullivan Tower in downtown Chicago. The door clicked shut, severing them from the chaotic noise of the reception, the prying eyes of the syndicate, and the suffocating scent of lilies. Inside, the suite was a masterclass in cold, minimalist wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic, dizzying view of the city's glowing grid. The furniture was all dark leather, brushed steel and shadows. There were no photographs. There was no warmth. Netta dropped her small clutch onto a glass console table. The sharp clatter echoed in the vast room. Aiden bypassed her entirely, walking straight to a crystal decanter resting on a wet bar near the window. He poured 2 fingers of amber liquid, the sound of the pour filling the tense, heavy air. He stripped off his tuxedo jacket, tossing it carelessly over the back of a leather armchair. The holster strapped to his chest was stark and black against his crisp white shirt. He didn't take the gun off. Drink? Aiden asked, not turning around. No. Netta stood frozen near the entryway. The exhaustion she had been fighting off all day suddenly crashed into her bones, heavy as lead. Her scalp ached from the dozens of pins holding her hair in place. The corset of her dress felt like a vice, restricting the air to her lungs. She reached behind her back, her fingers blindly fumbling with the tiny, impossible silk buttons lining the spine of her dress. Her hands were shaking too badly. She managed to undo 2 before her fingers cramped, useless and trembling. A frustrated, deeply human sigh escaped her lips. She closed her eyes, fighting the sudden, humiliating sting of tears. She would not cry. Not in front of him. Footsteps moved silently across the plush carpet. "Drop your hands," Aiden said. His voice was right behind her. Netta stiffened, but obeyed, letting her hands fall to her sides. Aiden's large, calloused fingers brushed against her bare back. The contrast between the cold room and the heat of his skin made her shiver violently. He didn't rush. He moved with a slow, meticulous precision, undoing the tiny buttons one by one. The brush of his knuckles against her spine was a devastating mixture of threat and intimacy. "You asked earlier what the price for your little display at the altar would be," Aiden murmured, his breath stirring the loose hairs at her neck. "Did you really think I would strike you in return? You are a violent man, Aiden." Netta answered, staring straight ahead at the reflection of the city lights in a dark mirror. "Violence is your currency. It's a logical assumption. Physical violence is crude. It's a tool for men who lack imagination." He undid the final button near the small of her back. The heavy silk bodice loosened immediately, allowing Netta to draw her first full breath in 12 hours. Aiden stepped back, giving her space. He picked up his glass from the console table and took a slow sip. "Your brother is safely in London," Aiden stated. It wasn't a reassurance. It was laying the groundwork for a trap. "He has an apartment in Mayfair, a generous allowance. He is untouchable, just as I promised your father." Netta turned around, clutching the front of her dress to keep it from slipping. She looked at Aiden warily. And he will stay there." Aiden continued smoothly, walking towards the massive windows, looking out over the city he owned. "He will live a long, comfortable life, on one condition." The other shoe was dropping. Netta braced herself, her knuckles turning white where she gripped the lace. "What condition?" Aiden turned to face her. The city lights cast long, dramatic shadows across his face, highlighting the deep bruise on his jaw. "You spent your entire life trying to stay out of the mud, Netta. You went to art galleries in Paris. You curated charity galas. You looked down on your father's business, pretending the blood money funding your trust fund didn't exist." He walked slowly back toward her, stopping just out of arm's reach. "Your punishment is simple. You don't get to hide in the clean light anymore." Aiden tilted his head, his blue eyes locking onto hers with terrifying intensity. "You are going to sit in on my meetings. You are going to review the shipping manifests. When a problem arises on the docks, you are going to help me solve it. You aren't going to be a trophy sitting in a penthouse. You are going to be my partner." Netta stared at him in sheer disbelief. A cold horror washed over her, far more potent than the fear of physical harm. "You want to make me complicit?" She breathed, the reality of his demand sinking in. He didn't just want her body or her family's territory. He wanted to corrupt her soul. He wanted to drag her down into the exact darkness she had spent 30 years running from. "I want you to see the world as it actually is, not as you wish it to be," Aiden replied coldly. "If you refuse, if you hide in this tower, if you play the victim, if you try to shut your eyes to what I do, I will make one phone call, and Declan's comfortable life in Mayfair will end very, very badly." He took a step closer, raising a hand to lightly trace the slope of her bare shoulder. "That is the price for slapping me, Netta. You don't get to be innocent anymore." Netta looked up into his face. He was utterly serious. The genius of his cruelty was breathtaking. He had weaponized her own morals against her, using her love for her brother to chain her to his criminal empire. "You're insane," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of rage and profound despair. Aidan smiled, a cold, sharp curving of his lips. He leaned down, his mouth grazing her cheek as he spoke into her ear. "I am pragmatic, my love. Now take off the dress. I want to see exactly what I bought." Sunlight felt like an intrusion. It spilled across the tangled silk sheets of the penthouse, harsh and entirely unwelcome. Netta woke with an aching stiffness in her shoulders, staring at the ceiling. She was alone in the massive bed. The space beside her was immaculately made, as if Aidan hadn't slept at all. Given the man's terrifying hypervigilance, it was entirely possible he hadn't. She sat up, pulling the sheet tightly to her chest. The memory of the previous night hung in the air, a heavy, complicated knot of humiliation, survival, and a jarring, unwanted physical intensity. He had stripped her of her armor, layer by layer, demanding not just submission, but presence. He hadn't forced her. He had cornered her, using the exact same psychological precision he used to dismantle rival syndicates. He made her want to fight back, and in doing so, he made her participate. A sharp knock on the bedroom door broke her train of thought. "Enter," Netta said, her voice raspy. A woman in a pristine maid's uniform stepped in, holding a garment bag. She kept her eyes glued to the floor. "Mr. Sullivan requested you be downstairs in 45 minutes, ma'am. He had this sent up for you." She hung the bag on the closet door and vanished like a frightened apparition. Netta threw off the covers and unzipped the bag. Inside hung a slate-grey skirt suit, tailored to razor-sharp perfection. It was armor. Corporate, unforgiving armor. It was exactly what one wore to a board meeting, or a sentencing hearing. 45 minutes later, she stepped out of the private elevator and into the lower levels of the Sullivan Tower. The air down here was different. It didn't smell of luxury. It smelled of stale coffee, ozone from server racks, and expensive cigars. This was the engine room. Aidan was waiting for her at the head of a long mahogany conference table. The room was populated by 6 men. None of them wore tuxedos today. They wore heavy wool suits, and the underlying tension in their posture screamed of street-level violence, poorly disguised as legitimate business. Tommy stood against the far wall, a silent mountain of muscle. Conversation died the second Netta walked in. 6 pairs of hard, assessing eyes locked onto her. "Gentlemen," Aidan said smoothly, not rising from his chair. "My wife." He gestured to the empty leather chair immediately to his right. Netta walked the length of the room. Her heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. She didn't look at the floor. She looked each man in the eye as she passed, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her intimidation. She took her seat. "We are discussing the Southside integration," Aidan continued, picking up right where he left off, as if placing a former enemy's daughter in his inner sanctum was entirely routine. "Specifically the warehouse logistics your father formerly managed, Netta." He slid a thick, leather-bound ledger across the table. It stopped precisely in front of her. "You have a degree in finance, do you not?" Aidan asked, sipping from a black coffee mug. "Before you decided to curate modern art, you ran your father's legitimate books for 2 years. Netta stared at the ledger. It was a physical manifestation of his threat from the night before. "You are going to be my partner. You don't get to be innocent anymore." She could refuse. She could sit in silent protest. But she knew exactly what Aidan would do. He would smile, end the meeting, and make a phone call to London. She opened the book. For the next 2 hours, the men argued over shipping routes, union bribes, and port authority schedules. It was dry, tedious talk, hiding a massive undercurrent of extortion. A capo named Valenti, a thick-necked man with a permanent sneer, was dominating the conversation. He was presenting the revenue projections for the newly acquired Campbell Roots. "The transition is smooth," Valenti grunted, tapping a thick finger against a printed spreadsheet. "We're absorbing the roots, paying off the dock workers, but the yield is down 8% from what Campbell claimed. The old man was cooking his books to look fatter." Netta's eyes scanned the open ledger in front of her. Numbers were an absolute truth. They didn't lie, they didn't posture, and they didn't carry guns. She traced a column of figures, cross-referencing them with the dates on Valenti's printed sheet. Something clicked. A cold, sharp realization settled in her gut. Her father was a coward and a terrible gambler, but he wasn't stupid enough to lie to Aidan Sullivan about the yield of his ports before a forced acquisition. He would have known Aidan's accountants would audit every dime. Netta looked up. He wasn't cooking the books. The room went dead silent. Valenti stopped tapping his spreadsheet. He looked at Netta with a mixture of amusement and deep irritation. "Excuse me, Mrs. Sullivan. My father didn't inflate the numbers," Netta said, her voice remarkably steady. She tapped the ledger. "The tonnage coming into Port 4 matches the invoices, but the outbound freight dropping at the rail yards is missing 12% of its manifest, every single Tuesday and Thursday." Valenti's face flushed a dull, ugly red. "You're reading it wrong. It's a transition period. Spoilage, breakage. Breakage doesn't operate on a fixed bi-weekly schedule." Netta shot back, her corporate instincts taking the wheel, overriding her fear. "And it certainly doesn't perfectly match the exact schedule of the third shift freight foreman you installed last month. The yield isn't down, Mr. Valenti. It's being skimmed." The air in the room instantly turned lethal. Accusing a capo of skimming was a death sentence if unproven. Valenti slammed his hands on the table, half rising from his chair. "You listen to me, you little—" "Sit down, Valenti." Aidan's voice barely rose above a conversational murmur, but it carried the weight of a falling anvil. Valenti froze. Slowly, agonizingly, he lowered himself back into his chair. Aidan turned his head, looking at Netta. The bruise on his jaw was fading to a yellowish green, but his eyes were bright, alight with a terrifying, profound approval. He looked at her the way a proud handler looks at a hawk that has just drawn blood for the first time. "Show me," Aidan said softly. Netta slid the ledger toward him, pointing to the columns. She walked him through the math, her voice crisp and devoid of emotion. She laid out the discrepancy with surgical precision, trapping Valenti in a cage constructed entirely of his own sloppy bookkeeping. When she finished, Aidan stared at the numbers for a long, quiet minute. He closed the ledger. The sound was a definitive, terrifying snap. He looked at Valenti. "Tommy," Aidan said, not breaking eye contact with the sweating capo. "Take Mr. Valenti to the warehouse. We will join him shortly." Smells define a memory far better than sight. Netta knew she would never forget the scent of this moment. Damp concrete, industrial bleach, and the sharp metallic tang of absolute terror. The warehouse near Port 4 was cavernous and poorly lit. It was a place designed for the movement of heavy crates, not human beings. Yet in the center of the vast, empty floor, Valenti knelt on the concrete. His hands were zip-tied behind his back. Two of Tommy's men stood behind him, their faces completely devoid of expression. Netta stood 10 feet away. The slate-grey skirt suit offered no warmth against the biting chill of the warehouse. She felt sick. A cold, heavy stone of nausea sat in the pit of her stomach, threatening to claw its way up her throat. Aidan stood entirely relaxed, his hands tucked into the pockets of his dark overcoat. He looked at Valenti the way one might look at a rusted bolt on a luxury car, an annoyance that needed to be discarded. "You stole from me, Paulie," Aidan said. The use of the man's first name made the statement infinitely more chilling. During an acquisition, you made me look foolish in front of my new wife. Boss, I swear on my mother, it was a mistake. Valenti babbled, his voice cracking, entirely stripped of the arrogant bravado he had displayed in the boardroom. The foreman, they took liberties. I wasn't watching them close enough. It's a management failure, not a theft. I'll make it right. Double. Aidan sighed. It was a tired, deeply cynical sound. He turned to Netta. He's lying, of course. Aidan said, adopting a conversational tone, as if they were discussing the weather. He set up a ghost corporation to funnel the missing freight into the black market. We've already found the paperwork. Aidan took his right hand out of his coat pocket. He was holding a sleek, silver fountain pen. He held it out to Netta. Your catch, Netta. Your kill. Netta stared at the pen. It felt heavier than Tommy's gun. What are you asking me to do? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. I am asking you to pass sentence. Aidan replied. He stole from the Campbell roots. He disrespected you in my boardroom. If I make the call, they will fear me. If you make the call, they will fear you. He was forcing her hand over the fire. If she showed mercy, she would be branded weak, a liability. The men in this syndicate would never respect her. They would actively scheme against her, and Aidan would view her as a failed experiment. Declan's safety would evaporate, but if she ordered a man's death, the Netta she used to be, the woman who curated art and tried to stay clean, would die right alongside him. Valenti looked up at her, tears cutting tracks through the grime on his face. Mrs. Sullivan, please. I have a family. I have daughters. You're not like them. You're a good woman. Your father, he knew me. Please. The appeal to her father was a mistake. Netta looked at the man begging on his knees. She remembered the sheer arrogance he had displayed just hours ago. He hadn't cared about his daughters when he was skimming millions. He hadn't cared about her when he thought she was just a pretty hostage holding a ledger. He was a parasite, feeding off a violent machine. Something hard and essential locked into place inside Netta's chest. The fear evaporated, replaced by a cold, searing clarity. She didn't take the pen. She looked at Aidan. Killing him is a waste of capital. Netta said, her voice ringing out clear and sharp in the echoing warehouse. Aidan raised an eyebrow, a flicker of genuine surprise crossing his features. Go on. If you put a bullet in his head, you create a martyr for his loyalists. You create a mess you have to clean up, and a widow you have to pay off to keep quiet. Netta said, her eyes shifting back to Valenti, pinning him to the floor with her stare. He said he has a family, he has assets. She stepped closer to the kneeling man. Valenti shrank back. You don't get to die easily, Paulie. Netta said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly calm register. You are going to sign over every property you own, every offshore account, and every trust fund you set up for your daughters directly to the Sullivan Syndicate. You are going to liquidate your entire existence to pay back what you stole with interest. Valenti stared at her, sheer horror dawning on his face. She wasn't just threatening his life, she was threatening his legacy. She was erasing him. You leave him with nothing. Netta continued, turning back to Aidan. You strip him bare, then you put him on a bus to nowhere. If he ever shows his face in Chicago again, or if he tries to contact his old crew, you let Tommy deal with him. But let him live in the poverty he tried to avoid by stealing from us. The silence that followed was absolute. Even Tommy, standing in the shadows, looked mildly disturbed. It was a bloodless execution, a corporate dismantling of a human life that was, in many ways, far crueler than a quick bullet. Aidan stared at her for a long, suspended moment. He slowly slid the silver pen back into his coat pocket. A slow, brilliant smile spread across his face, reaching all the way to his icy blue eyes. My God! Aidan whispered, a profound reverence in his voice. "You are magnificent." He looked at Tommy. "You heard my wife. Get the lawyers on the phone. Strip him down to his shoelaces." Aidan offered his arm to Netta. She looked at the crook of his elbow. It was the same gesture her father had offered her outside the cathedral doors. But this time, she wasn't a hostage being led to the altar. She was a partner walking off the battlefield. Netta placed her hand on his arm. She felt sick. She felt terrified. But as they walked out of the dark warehouse and back into the cold Chicago sunlight, she also felt an undeniable, intoxicating rush of absolute power. The descent was complete. She had not only survived the lion's den, she had just learned how to command the pride. Winter arrived in Chicago with a bitter, biting cruelty. The wind off Lake Michigan howled through the steel canyons of the city, but inside the Sullivan Tower the climate was meticulously controlled. 6 months had passed since the wedding. 6 months since Netta Campbell traded her soul for her brother's life and found herself reigning over an empire of thieves. She stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse, watching the snow fall over the grid of the city. She wore a tailored black blazer and a silk camisole, a glass of expensive bourbon resting loosely in her hand. The liquor didn't burn her throat anymore. She had grown accustomed to the bite. Behind her, the heavy oak doors of the private study clicked shut. Aidan walked into the room, discarding his overcoat over a leather chair. He looked tired. The war with the Callahan Syndicate out of Boston was dragging into its 3rd week, bleeding resources and patience. "They hit the supply trucks on I-90, Aidan said, pouring himself a drink from the crystal decanter. He didn't ask how her day was. They didn't do small talk. Their marriage was built on ledgers, logistics, and survival. 2 drivers dead. 3 million in electronics hijacked. Netta didn't flinch. 6 months ago, the mention of dead men would have sent her spiraling into a panic attack. Now she simply calculated the loss. "Boston is testing our borders," Netta said, turning away from the window. She walked over to the sprawling mahogany desk, pulling up a digital map on the tablet resting there. "Callahan knows we're still integrating my father's old roots. He thinks the South Side is weak. He's striking where the transition is messiest." Aidan walked over and stood beside her. He leaned his hip against the edge of the desk, crossing his arms. He smelled of cold air, cigar smoke, and cordite. "And your recommendation, Mrs. Sullivan?" It was a test. It was always a test with him. But Netta no longer felt like a student desperately trying to guess the right answer. She was his equal. She had proven it a dozen times over since the day she dismantled Paulie Valenti without shedding a single drop of blood. The men in the syndicate no longer looked at her with pity or amusement. They looked at her with a profound, terrifying respect. "We stopped playing defense," Netta said coldly. She tapped a location on the digital map. "Callahan's brother runs a high-stakes underground casino in the Back Bay. It's their primary cash wash. If we send Tommy and a crew to burn it to the ground, not steal the money, just burn it, we send a message. We don't want their territory. We just want them to know we can reach out and touch them whenever we please." Aidan stared at the map. His icy blue eyes tracked the logistics of her plan, turning the variables over in his mind. Slowly, his gaze shifted from the screen to her face. The look he gave her was heavy, dark, and intensely possessive. It wasn't the look of a boss evaluating a lieutenant. It was the look of a man staring at the only person in the world who truly understood him. "Burning a casino full of Boston high society politicians and judges will draw federal heat," Aidan noted, his voice a low rumble in the quiet room. "Not if the fire starts in the vault." Netta countered effortlessly. "The structural integrity of the basement will contain the blaze, but the cash reserves will turn to ash. No casualties. Just a devastating financial blow. Callahan will have to explain to his investors why their money evaporated. He'll be too busy fighting a civil war to look at Chicago." Aidan reached out. His large hand cupped the side of her neck, his thumb resting against her jawline. The physical contact was sudden, sending a familiar electric jolt straight down Netta's spine. Their physical relationship had evolved exactly like their partnership, cautious, explosive, and entirely stripped of pretense. "You are a terrifying woman, Netta," he murmured, leaning down until his lips hovered inches from hers. "You made me this way," she whispered back, refusing to break eye contact. "No," Aidan corrected softly, brushing his mouth against hers. "I just handed you the chisel. You carved yourself." He kissed her, deep and bruising, a physical manifestation of the dark, twisted bond tying them together. When he finally pulled away, his eyes were sharp. "Call Tommy," Aidan ordered, stepping back from the desk. "Tell him to pack for winter in New England, and tell him to bring the incendiaries." Netta picked up the secure encrypted phone. She dialed the head of security without a single tremor in her fingers. She was no longer the doe bleeding out in the snow. She was the wolf dragging the carcass home. 2 nights later, the air in the penthouse was thick with an unnatural, heavy anticipation. Netta sat on the edge of the leather sofa, her eyes glued to the muted television screen playing the late-night news cycle. Aidan sat in the armchair opposite her, meticulously cleaning a disassembled Sig Sauer. The metallic clicks and slides of the weapon parts were the only sounds in the room. The clock on the wall struck 2 in the morning. Right on cue, the encrypted phone on the coffee table buzzed. It was a harsh, jarring sound. Aidan didn't stop oiling the barrel of his gun. He simply nodded at the phone. "Answer it." Netta picked up the heavy black device and pressed it to her ear. "Yes. It's done." Tommy's gravelly voice came through the receiver. There was no background noise, no sirens, just the cold, clinical report of a job finished. "Vault is a total loss. No casualties. We're on the private jet back to O'Hare now." "Understood," Netta said. "Have a safe flight." She hung up and set the phone back on the glass table. She looked at Aidan. "Callahan's vault is ashes." Aidan finally paused his work. He reassembled the slide with a sharp, satisfying crack, setting the weapon down on the side table. He leaned back in his chair, a slow, dangerous smile spreading across his face. "Checkmate," Aidan said softly, but the victory felt strange in Netta's chest. It wasn't the euphoric rush of winning a game. It was a cold, heavy realization of permanence. She had just ordered the destruction of a multi-million-dollar enterprise. She had committed a massive federal crime, orchestrated across state lines to protect a criminal syndicate she once despised. She looked at her hands. They were perfectly manicured, soft, and entirely clean. But they felt soaked in gasoline. Aidan watched her. He saw the microscopic shift in her posture, the slight tightening of her jaw. He stood up, walking across the space between them, and knelt in front of her. It was a jarring sight. The most feared man in the Midwest kneeling on the floor of his penthouse. He took her hands in his. His grip was warm and grounding. "Regrets?" he asked, his voice stripped of all its usual arrogance and command. Netta looked into his pale blue eyes. She searched her own soul, digging past the cynicism, the fear, and the deeply ingrained morals of her past. She thought of her father, drinking himself to death in a lonely mansion, a victim of his own weakness. She thought of Declan, living a shallow, empty life in London, entirely dependent on her sacrifice. Then she looked at the man kneeling in front of her. He had taken her hostage, yes, but he had also given her absolute power. He had demanded her agency. He had forced her to open her eyes, to fight, and to conquer. "No," Netta said, and to her own profound shock, it was the absolute truth. "No regrets." Aidan's smile softened into something incredibly rare, something entirely genuine. He brought her hands to his lips, kissing her knuckles. "Then we are bound, Netta," he whispered, "in blood, in fire, and in everything that comes next. There is no going back to the light." "I know," she replied, her voice steady and resolute. "I've found I prefer the dark. It's easier to see the monsters coming." Aiden laughed, a rich, dark sound that filled the cavernous room. He stood, pulling her up with him, wrapping his arms around her waist. She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady, calm beating of his heart. Outside, the snow continued to fall, burying the city of Chicago under a blanket of pristine white. It covered the dirt, the blood, and the sins of the men who ran the streets. But inside the tower, Netta Sullivan stood at the apex of the underworld, entirely awake and entirely in control. The hostage had become the queen, and she would never, ever let them take her crown. If you felt the chill of Aiden's gaze or the sting of Netta's slap, don't let the story end here. The criminal underworld is unforgiving, and there are countless more tales of loyalty, betrayal, and dark romance waiting to be uncovered. If you enjoyed this journey into the Sullivan Syndicate, hit that like button to support the channel. Share this video with someone who loves a cynical, high-stakes drama, and make sure to subscribe and ring the notification bell so you never miss our next ruthless story. Welcome to the family.